So Chris, what is this SEC rule all about? And I guess more importantly, are we making too big of a deal out of this thing?
So, I mean, there's two ways to look at that. So what's it about? It's about more reporting for public companies. So for public companies and cybersecurity reporting at that. So let me just specify that. So from an auditor's perspective, so I put my auditor hat on, it's kind of a good thing because now we've got more opportunities to get the public sector up to a point from a financial reporting perspective to where everyone else is or where everyone else should be. So what is the rule? Well, more reporting. So, more financial reporting, more intermittent reporting. If there is an incident, a cybersecurity incident that needs attention, and more transparency. And so that could be taken in multiple ways. And there's been many discussions on that. But really, are we making too big of a deal of it? And I have seen different perspectives in the press. So I think, from my perspective, not really. I think the goals are good for the industry as a whole. As I was saying, it's from a reporting perspective, from a cybersecurity perspective, let's get everyone up to the same level to thwart attacks and cybersecurity incidents and protect data, which is really what we're trying to do. Of course, this is going to increase the regulatory burden on public companies. And when you think of it, it's not just the sort of reporting on this new 8K regulatory filing, which is you have an incident, hey, you're going to have to report on that, and there's different there's very specific guidelines on how you need to disclose that information. Now, that's one perspective. So the intermittent disclosure reporting, as well as a yearly reporting, is required as well. So if you look at this from a public company's perspective, you think, oh my gosh, there's more reporting I have to do. But it's focusing on cybersecurity reporting, which is, I think, is the critical part of this rule. And that's where I think it's a good thing, and that it starts to blend in with a lot of the reporting that is required within the financial sector, and even at a global scale. So if you're doing due diligence because you're a PE firm and you've just acquired a new portfolio company, you're going to have to include some of this reporting in that due diligence process. Or if you're doing an M&A, you're going to have to include some of this reporting into that process as well. So again, lots of reporting, but merging cybersecurity thinking in with the usual reporting that you would have to do in any respect.
Yeah, and I think anytime the conversation starts to be enriched around metrics, especially foundational metrics, things around managing risk for patch management or vulnerability management or endpoint security, these things that are just really meaty, really foundational to security and risk management. Shining a light on that, I think, helps everybody. And sure, we've got the 8K, the annual reports, the committee charters, corporate governance documents, all of these things that really take into consideration material risk, right? These are things that stakeholders and stockholders really care about. And quite honestly, if you know about it and you don't report it, that's illegal, right? And there's fines and penalties tied to that. So I do think that the spotlight that is on this now, or sort of enriching that conversation, is a really positive thing. But I'm wondering, there's other financial regulations out there, of course. Does this SEC rule sort of influence or blend or affect those other regulations in any way?
It definitely does. And I think that's the opportunity. So there's an opportunity for harmonization within the industry as a whole, and definitely for public companies. And so Brian, you mentioned a really important topic, is the material impact or the material risk. And that is a key term that's used throughout the rule. Well, what is material impact and material risk? That is something that is elevating the use of evidence-based data. And when you look at that in terms of what other financial regulations and other regulations that are affecting your average public company, they all have a theme in them, which is moving towards evidence-based data. because they're trying to measure risk. So trying to find out how risky is this new vulnerability within my system. And this is the theme that's in a lot of regulations, including, the FTC, the FDIC, the FFIEC, and the list goes on and on and on. They all have this theme of asking you to determine if something is risky, number one, and number two, can you prove that it's risky? So because there's an exercise that we go through as cybersecurity professionals where we try to find gaps within our systems at a simplistic level. But we can find gaps all day long, and then we can sit in front of our auditor and say, I found all these vulnerabilities, and yeah, these are risky to me. Well, what does that mean? And I don't know any auditor in this day and age that would sign the report on compliance based on you saying, yeah, just take my word for it. These are risky. Yeah, these matter to my organization. Well, there's you have no level of material risk there. You have no proof of if you don't have evidence-based data, then you have no proof to say, I can say without a doubt. And
I like that term you used, evidence-based data, because I think of, you need a baseline of your security program. And I don't think anybody would disagree. That's, security 101. But a failure within a material risk that's tied to something that you have evidence for, if you don't have the data to back it up, if you don't have the evidence to show what exactly happened, there's legal and there's regulatory commitments that fail. And I think a lot of the metrics, not all the metrics, but a lot of metrics out there are kind of vanity metrics, if you will. It's kind of like the metrics you might get on social media. Oh, 50 billion people liked my post. Maybe not, right? And some of these things I think of, number of malware infections blocked a day. Best effort for percentage of computers patched. I guess these are good things to know, but honestly, I want to know things like, critical vulnerabilities from an operational perspective, like how many devices do I have deployed? And do they have security controls on them? And are those security controls under deployed, right? And if I look at my my vulnerability assessment or my endpoint security tools, just simply telling me I've got 50,000 devices, 5,000 don't have any security controls installed on them, and another 5,000, maybe those security controls just aren't up to date or they're not working properly. These are important things. And I think if you look at, like, if I'm missing an endpoint agent, that's probably just as, if not more critical than almost all CVEs. Right? There's certainly some really bad CVEs, especially level 10s and some level 9s. But if I'm missing my security controls, or I've got a whole bunch of end-of-life systems, man, that's really core to that sort of that foundational metrics. So I guess my question in there is, will this new SEC rule, is it gonna help, or is it gonna hinder these mandatory public company reporting processes from an assessment perspective? And is this kind of disclosure, potentially doing more harm than it's doing good?
So I think it's going to, unfortunately, I'm going to take the easy answer. It's going to do both. Okay. Now, I'm a optimistic pessimist, pessimistic optimist. Let me get that straight. So yeah, it's going to shake up the internal workings of any public company that's facing this. And to your point on the focus on business controls or reporting on business controls versus looking at true operational metrics or operational controls, I think that this new rule is going to encourage and accelerate the move to focus on the operational controls, because as you said, you can say, we blocked so many thousand incidents of malware, but that doesn't mean anything if you're experiencing 10,000 incidents of malware per day, and you're getting a certain percentage of that. That metric may look good, but it doesn't really mean anything at this point, because you really have no idea of which of those particular malware incidents are actually risky to your organization, because you may have a system that's sitting out in the wild in production that maybe has not supported anymore and maybe can't be patched. And then that one vulnerability that has slipped through can affect that one machine. And as we know, it's the weakest link in the chain. Yeah. So I think so. As a whole, then, to get back to the question, is I'm hoping that it's going to be more on the positive side. So I think it's definitely, I know it's going to encourage the confluence between IT security, compliance, and legal. And it's what I get at. So the thing I live by, my mission statement, is to join compliance and security together, so that they're thinking alike, that they're in line with the same goal. And that's a very simplistic expression, but this new rule is essentially pushing companies to focus on operational controls, to look at their core security controls, to think about cybersecurity, and to measure risk across that, because they're looking for anything that's going to have material impact.
Yeah.
So there's no choice but to start focusing on operational controls and looking for that evidence-based data that will allow them to sit in front of an audit and then make statements that are enforceable. They can say, I'm 100% sure that this is the highest risk to my organization, and I can prove it.
Yeah, here's my backing evidence for all these foundational metrics. And to me, it's really nuts and bolts stuff, like how many devices do I have? Do I know what applications I'm running? Do I know about all my users and all the different identities and cross correlation between those? So fundamentally understanding my assets. Then out of those, which ones are managed or unmanaged? Which ones are missing endpoint security or patch management controls or other key controls? And just kind of give me that breakdown. Boy, it seems like it's table stakes. So, with that, how does asset intelligence and vulnerability hunting and continuous security control monitoring, all these things are kind of an outshoot of that, knowing what you've got. How's that impacting this SEC rule?
So all of those themes are, well, first of all, they're themes that, it's interesting. They have a huge impact on this, or potential impact. As I said, it's an opportunity to reinforce these types of programs and reanalyze these programs within any organization, with any enterprise. So again, as an audit professional, I see this as asset intelligence, knowing where your vulnerabilities are and being able to prove that those particular vulnerabilities are as risky to your organization as you think they are, or when you found them, and then being able to continuously monitor that. That's a trend in the industry that we've been trying to move towards for, gosh, it must be 20 years now. I mean, I was talking about this back in the earlier days of cybersecurity.
Yeah.
But I think that so I know that they will help. And really what it relates to is the ability that, unfortunately, with rules, whenever we have new rules, it's kind of like, okay, I got to follow the rules. Well, in my opinion, thankfully, the rules encourage you to look at how you assess your systems, how you identify threats, how you manage those threats. And then you have to report on how your leadership team understands, well, the entire team, how it understands the governance aspect of that. So how are you going to prove essentially that these processes that you're doing are ironclad? Well, that again points to the industry trend towards proactive and continuous assessment. And I'm rolling it up to more of a higher level perspective. But really what this is I like to call it is proactive vulnerability prioritization.
Yeah.
And it's a mouthful, but in terms of assessment and, from my perspective, living, eating, and breathing compliance, or GRC, and living within that world, the trend towards analyzing where your gaps are has been moving closer and closer to a continuous state. And in fact, in many regulations, it's a requirement, meaning you not only have to patch your systems, but you got to continuously find vulnerabilities. And then, by the way, you have to risk rank them. So if anyone doesn't know, I've spent an awful long time very closely associated with the PCI DSS, or the SSE, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. And it's a data security standard, and it follows the same sort of foundational framework of most cybersecurity data protection regulations. And it has been moving closer and closer towards a point where not only do you have to find things and prove that you have technology or something in place, but you have to prove that it's working. And then when you find stuff, you have to prove that this is the stuff that is the most important stuff.
Yeah.
So that's really simplifying it. But if you apply this to vulnerability prioritization or gap prioritization, well, you got to find those vulnerabilities and you have to risk rank them. And the process is actually written clearly to risk rank them. You have to risk rank them, and then you have to show them to your assessor or your auditor to say, these are my top 10 vulnerabilities. These are my top 100 vulnerabilities, whatever that number is. But you have to then prove and use your evidence-based data to say that these are in fact the most risky to your organization, and you have the answer. So how does that relate back to asset intelligence? It's one of the most important aspects of your discovery and your assessment of your systems, because if, as we stated earlier, if you have an end of support system hanging out there somewhere, you don't know about that, well, then you risk failing, not just failing your compliance program, but more importantly, being breached. So these types of technologies are extremely important to having a successful and accelerating your goals towards 100% enforceable reporting under the SEC rule.
Yeah, and just a simple example I think of, it's great to do a vulnerability assessment within an organization. It will just take, desktops and laptops, for example, and you identify, here are some high-level threats, medium-level threats, low-level threats. Okay, that's valuable information. In addition to that, maybe I know that 15% of those devices are end of life, but they have extended service support and they're still getting patches. Another 5% are end of life and they're not getting anything, like Windows 2008 release 2. There's no extended support, there's no patches, there's nothing. They're just sitting there vulnerable. These are important things to know, but it doesn't stop there. It's also saying, are the security controls operating on those devices that can help mitigate some of those risks, right? If I don't know if about the presence and state of my EDR or my patch management or my segmentation or whatever my tools might be, I don't really have a complete picture. Telling me that I have a vulnerability on an end-of-life operating system is important, but I also need to know about the controls, the security controls around those devices. And I think that's a real big miss when a lot of people try to understand where their risk is. So with that, as we wrap up here, what are some things that companies can do perhaps before, during, and after a breach as it relates to the Sevco Asset Intelligence platform?
So one of the big ones is understanding the makeup and the distribution, or let's call it the telemetry of gaps within their systems and the makeup of their enterprise. So their enterprise as a whole. So, one of the simple processes is doing a re-inventory. And when I was an auditor, this was the first. It is the first part of an audit. You do pre-compliance data gathering, and one of the first things you ask for is a listing of their inventory. And usually you get an Excel spreadsheet, but that's another story and something to talk about another day. But essentially, that reinitialization or revisit that you need to do is essentially analyzing it from a gap perspective. So you're looking at asset inventory from a different perspective. You're looking at that. You're trying to determine the relationship between the gaps that you have and your asset inventory. So, and your example was perfect. You might have an end of support system, but maybe that's still getting patches. So you're okay. But you might have one that is no longer supported and getting patches. And so it's done. So you have to have enough knowledge to be able to say, okay, this is one of the situations where compliance does equal security. And as I said, that's my goal, to change that. Compliance does equal security when you know that you will fail your compliance program if that system is no longer supported and you're not getting patches. But more importantly, because you know that and you've triangulated that back to that gap, back to your asset inventory, well, now you can take action on that and correct the situation. And again, to your point, address your security stack so that your security solution has some form of compensating control to make sure that that system is protected. Well, now you're okay. Now, and you've done that because you want to be compliant, because the compliance rule says you can't leave that out there, else you're going to fail your regulatory responsibilities. Well, that's good because you're not going to fail it because you're going to take the initiative. So, I mean, that's one thing that you can do, and it's almost an obvious one, I think, from a both a security and compliance perspective. But you can also understand your BAUs, and this is an important one too, and it relates to understanding your enterprise. BAUs being business as usual activities, and this is something that's used in the audit community quite often and referred to. And what all that is, do you understand how your system or how your assets use data? Because you have two things in your enterprise that you're trying to protect: your assets and your data, and they're interwoven. And data could be users, by the way, as well. So it's sort of a generic way of looking at it. Do you understand this? Do you have some kind of policy in place that says this is the way we use data, and this is how the way users interact with data and interact with assets? So that's an extremely important thing. And having a continuous control over that would be a godsend in those situations. And I can tell you, as being an auditor, I would spend 2 weeks sometimes going through this process that we're outlining here, of just visiting the inventory or visiting assets and understanding the data or collecting the BAUs from an organization. So this is something that if you have a quick way of doing this, you're going to save yourself a lot of pain and suffering, because you have something that's proactive, even better. Yeah. And as well, obviously, not obviously, maybe to some, but revisit your third-party agreements and contracts. So understand how your third-party associations that most every single business has, how is that interacting with those assets, and how is that interacting with your enterprise and your BAUs? We need to know this, because we're going to have to report on that, because if one of them has a material impact and I have data collected that proves that, that's a great backup to have if there is a compelling security incident. So, and then the last thing I would recommend is review and ask for any cybersecurity frameworks that the organization might be using. Because we spoke about it at the beginning, and there's an opportunity here to harmonize the process between maybe other regulations that the company is facing. This could be a data protection mandate. You could be an organization operating in California, and you're subject to the CCPA. Well, a lot of the methods that have been put in place and the frameworks that we might be using to measure cybersecurity to protect consumer data are exactly the same as what I would need to do to collect that reporting that I'm going to be required to do now under the SEC. So there's that opportunity, but revisit them, or if you're the CISO, walk down and talk to legal, or let's get that conversation happening. That let's see that confluence happen, or talk to the GRC professionals or your manager of compliance. They might have a framework that they can put on your desk and save you a heck of a lot of time.
Absolutely. Well, that's great information, Chris. And for anyone that's interested in seeing how the Sevco asset intelligence platform can really help, looking at assets across users and applications and devices, and pulling from your EDR, your patch management, your cloud, your IAM, your PAM solutions, your IoT solutions, all of those have a little bit of insight to part of your critical asset inventory. But nobody else is really correlating all that information, deduplicating it, and, as Chris mentioned, making it so you can actually address environmental drift with continuous monitoring. You can identify your real high-level risks. You can start prioritizing, and you can also make other solutions like SIM and SOAR and CMDBs and products like that so much more effective, because you have a central sense of truth or source of truth that you're feeding into these critical devices. So great information, Chris. Thanks. And thanks everybody for listening to our little presentation here on the new SEC rule.